Have you taken psychedelics?
Yes, I have.
And yes, it sounds like it because exactly. Yes, you're right. It's the strangest of things, and when it comes to identity and the psychedelics' effect on human identity, it does create an experience that is transcendent to the very temporary human form that we're currently within. And
yes, well, there's a psychiatrist named Rick Strassman who was at the University of Texas, and he had been giving his experimental subjects. He's one of two groups that had got permission to start experimenting with psychedelics again. The other one was a group at Johns Hopkins who've been reporting the consequences of giving experimental subjects psilocybin in its chemical form. They've reported permanent personality transformations on the part of the people who took the psilocybin mushrooms who had a mystical experience. And so what's happened to them, apart from the fact that they regarded the experience as one of the top 2 or 3 experiences of their life in terms of transformation, is that when you give them personality tests a year later, these are 5-factor personality tests, and they test extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. And openness is a creativity dimension, an aesthetic experience creativity dimension. And their scores on openness increase substantially, approximately the equivalent of from the 50th percentile to the 85th percentile, which is 1 standard deviation. They increase and stay that way up to 1 year later. So wow. These chemicals, these strange chemicals, produce very long-lasting effects on people's perception, and they do produce intimations of mystical experience. Now, Strassman actually got scared away from his DMT research. He was a pretty, I would say, conservative scientist and was administering DMT intravenously because it has a very short half-life. If you take it any other way, it only lasts about 10 minutes.
Right.
And his people, who were very carefully screened to begin with for sanity and so forth, although they had some experience with psychedelic drugs because they didn't want to introduce naive people to anything like that.
Right.
They all reported being shot out of their body and encountering alien beings.
Yes.
All of them. And they, when Strassman attempted to explain that away as let's call it a hallucination, although technically, if you're hallucinating, you know that you're hallucinating and you know what's real. So these were far deeper than hallucinations.
Right.
Or that they were something like Jungian archetypes, but his subjects insisted that, including people who knew quite a bit about archetypal psychology, insisted that that was not correct, that they were in fact shot out of their bodies into other spaces and dimensions, and that they encountered beings of all sorts of different types, some of whom were surprised to see them, some of whom were happy they were there, some of whom engaged them in conversation. It makes very strange reading.
Yes.
There's no straightforward way of making sense of it. And there's no straightforward way of making sense of the shamanic experiences too. Iliad had thought that those rituals had been, if they were induced by drugs, that was a corrupt form of the original ritual. But I think later scholarship has indicated that that's profoundly wrong, and that the basis of these experiences is in fact hallucinogenic experience of the sort, say, that the Aztecs induced with psilocybin mushrooms or mescaline.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And these experiences, when you can, the point I'm trying to make is I can empathize with a person who does not feel like they're the gender of their body, or whatever, or even that their body is who they are after having had enough of these experiences. And one of my teachers, Ram Dass, talks about how we're kind of simultaneously existing on these 2 platforms. One of them is the human world, and he calls it the marketplace. So, and this is where all the transactions happen that you're talking about, the negotiations. Well, I'm a juror, or a G, or a man, or a woman, or a comedian, or a doctor, or whatever. That's what's happening on that level. While simultaneously, there's this other level, this other platform that we exist in that has nothing to do with the human body at all. This is I think you were talking about the book of John. In the beginning was the Word, that thing.
Yeah.
So you can, sometimes I think that as we accelerate into whatever is going to happen, and I hope you have enough time to talk about your self-authoring program, because I have a question related to that. And maybe this is the perfect place to put that question in. In your self-authoring program, you talk about how it's good to write about the potential futures. And please stop me if I'm butchering this. So if I keep, acting like a lazy stoner, don't do anything for the next 6 years except the very minimal amount of effort that I have to keep food in my body and pay rent, what's my life going to look like in 6 years, in 10 years, in 15 years? So you sort of come up with that version of potential hell realm that you write for yourself. And then you also, what would happen if I actually started taking risks, became stronger, more focused, set goals, and moved in that direction? What would that life look like? So you get these two different, one beautiful timeline and one absolutely horrifying timeline. So it seems to me that in the same way as a species, we're witnessing these two potential timelines opening up. And one of them being...
Yes, well, that's exactly why heaven and hell are archetypal realities, and that cultures always have an intimation of them, because, it seems that that being is structured such that our choices determine the pathway that being will take as it unfolds.
Yes.
And consciousness seems to play a determining role in that. Obviously, it's not omnipotent. There are limitations to what any of us can do. We have a somewhat constrained sphere of immediate influence, although that can be expanded dramatically under certain conditions. And it certainly occurred to me, and I think this is I would say that this is a fundamental presupposition of Christianity at its deepest strata, is that people are always making a choice between transforming reality into something more closely approximating heaven or something more closely approximating hell.
Yes.
And we do the latter when we're motivated by resentment for the suffering that being entails, which is perfectly understandable. And we do the former when we attempt to manifest, let's say, that second part of us that you described, ever more truthfully and genuinely in the world, and thereby transcend our marketplace identities, or elevate those marketplace identities to something other than the mundane.
Yes.
The mundane and let's say short-sighted and impulsive and selfish in an unsophisticated way. And you see, I've come to believe that meaning, which is something that everyone absolutely needs and certainly experiences, at least the meaning of pain and suffering, you need a positive meaning to counterbalance that, so that you don't fall into the grip of resentment and hatred and all the things that can go along with that. That
Yes.
Gulag Archipelago is a very good indication of that. And
Yes.
to do that, you need to put your best foot forward and manifest your higher consciousness, so to speak, in the actual world. And if you do that, then you find that your life becomes imbued with a sense of positive meaning. And I think that that's actually an evolved function, that our nervous system isn't evolved to the world that we see with our senses precisely. It's evolved to the world as it's existed over massive spans of time. And the structures that exist over massive spans of time aren't the same ones that you see as they flip before you in your life. So one of those is explored territory, and another is unexplored territory, or order versus chaos, which is the way the Taoists conceptualize reality. And order is where you are when the things that you're doing are working the way you want them to.
Yes.
And there's a social element to that and a conceptual element. And then chaos is all those places and times where what you do produces something other than what you were predicting and desiring.
Yes.
And our nervous systems, as far as I've been able to tell, are specialized for that world. We treat the world as if it's explored versus unexplored territory, or order versus chaos. We try to maintain order.
Yes.
But it's more than that, because you can't just live in order, because order disintegrates. It disintegrates into chaos, as the yin-yang symbol indicates. And so in order to live in order properly, you have to live on the boundary between order and chaos, and continually to transform order on a constant basis so that it stays up to date and alive.
Yes.
And that's equivalent in the mythological sense to rescuing the dead father, which I've used Pinocchio as a classic example of that. You see the same thing in The Lion King, though, where when Simba undergoes his shamanic transformation, goes deep underground, he faces his father in his own reflection and then sees him in the sky and realizes that in order to conquer chaos and to regenerate the kingdom, he has to identify with his father, his dead father, see that within him, and then go fight evil. And at the end of that, there's flames and everything in that movie while he's battling Scar. And at the end, the rain comes. And that's a very old story.
Yes.
And
going into the depths to battle something in the self, right? That's the idea.
Well, or in the world. Like for Jung, the battle was something that occurred in interior space, say in the unconscious.
Yes.
But Jung was a visionary, and not everyone is like that. But you can certainly act out the same dynamic in the concrete physical world. I mean, Jung claimed as well in his most complex book, which was called Mysterium Conjunctionis, he said that the highest level of psychological integration came when you ceased making a distinction between the external world of your experience and the internal psychic world.
Wow.
And so what that would mean, for example, is that, if you're in a room and it's your room and the room is a mess, that there's no difference between the mess in that room and the mess in your psyche.
Right.
And that's you conceptualize that by realizing, that's one way of thinking about it, realizing that room, although it has an objective existence, is also an element of your subjectivity. Like the meaning of everything in that room is an element of your subjectivity. And so when you're in the room, there's no difference between that and being in you, and setting the room straight is the same as setting yourself straight.
Yes.
It's often the simplest place to start.